Hey everybody, and welcome back to another lecture with Coding with Roby. In this lecture, we're going to be enhancing our Read All Books API so a client can now dictate how many books are returned when they call the specific API. We will be accomplishing this by creating a query parameter that a user can optionally pass in that's going to dictate to return all books or just a specific number of books. So let's dive in. The first thing I'm going to do here is within our read all books parameter, I'm going to create a query parameter. I'm going to make the variable books to return with an optional int that's going to be equal to none. And now I want to keep this if length books is less than 1 to create books no API. I want to keep that as the first thing that happens when this API is called. And now outside this if statement, I'm going to create a new if statement that's going to check to make sure books to return is true, so it has data, and that length of books is greater than or equal to the books to return. So I need to make sure if a user passes in like 7 books to return, but there's only 5 books, then we're just going to return all the books and not have to worry about books to return because they're asking for more books than we currently have in our books list. I also need to make sure books to return is greater than 0 because if a user types in like -1, we can't return -1 books. So we're going to prevent this from happening. So if a user types in -1 or -2, we're just going to return all the books as well. So the first thing we need to do is if books to return and length of books is greater than or equal to books to return, which is greater than 0. And here we want to create a new variable, I, which is equal to 1. We want to create a new list object, so new books, which is equal to an empty list. And now I'm going to say while I is less than or equal to books to return, new books.append books at the I specific index -1. And then we want to say I plus equals 1, and then after the entire while loop is complete, just to return the new books. Alright, so let's think how this goes through. So when a user goes through our app.get, so our normal API call to retrieve all of the books, they may pass in a new integer at the end of the API. If a user does not pass in an integer, then this if statement is going to fail, which just returns all books at the end. So if a user doesn't type in anything, then we're just going to return all the books we currently have. If a user does pass in a variable, which is going to be an integer, then we want to make sure that books does have a value and that the length of books, so all of our books, is greater than or equal to the number the user is typing in. If not, we're just going to return all books. And lastly, we want to check to make sure books to return is greater than 0. If not, we're just going to return all books. We're then creating a variable I equals 1 and new books, which is equal to an empty list. And while I is less than books to return, we're just going to loop through all the books and add that element to the new books and return it. Let's save the file and try it out. So if I refresh our page and we say read all books, we now have an optional books to return query parameter we can pass in. If we just go ahead and execute without it, we'll see that we get all 4 books passed in. If we type in 1, we now get 1 book, author 1 and title 1. If we pass in 2, we now get 2 books returned as the response. If we pass in 3, we get 3. And lastly, if we pass in 4, we get all 4. And now let's check if we pass in 5. We still only get 4 with no error. And if we pass in -6, There should not be an error, but we will just return all the books that we currently have. This wraps up this lecture on how we made a new query parameter that we can add to read all books, so a user can now dictate whether they get all of the books or a specific number of books. And I will see you in the next video.